Let me quickly mute myself and see what happened. Oh, no.
Can I start with the lecture, or should I wait for the next
No, well,
attempt
it's
in
just
terms of
now
recording?
again said recording has started. So I'm going to say start the lecture because it seems to now be recording. Everything's looking good. So please carry on.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Lee Stone. To the learners or students, my name is Paul Mudau, and I'm a co-lecturer for the module of constitutional law, along with Professor Lee Stone and Professor Isaac Shai. The focus of tonight's lecture deals with the decolonization and Africanization of constitutional law. I will look at 5 elements or themes. The first one, it will be the personal is political decolonization of law through the dynamic power of identity and culture. The second part will be constructing the meanings of decolonized and Africanized constitutional law. Another important factor which I need to point from the outset is that constitutional law as a subject forms part of the broader legal education. Then the next part, it will be uh, decolonization and Africanization of legal education. Then the last one will be constitutional literacy in Africa. Constitutional law is a body of law which defines the role, powers, and the structure of different entities within a state, namely the executive, the parliament or legislature, and the judiciary, as well as the basic rights of citizens. And in federal or quasi-federal countries such as the United States, Canada, and South Africa, it provides for the relationship between the central government and the state, provincial or territorial governments, as well as the local government. A constitution is an organic or and fundamental law of a state that sets out the basic principles that establishes the state, the structures and the processes of government, and embodies the rights of people. Generally, a constitution is referred to as a written document that contains a set of fundamental legal political rules that govern both social and institutional relationships. However, practice has shown that not all constitutions are written. Constitutions, the established state institutions, allocate powers to these institutions, and essentially they define the limits of their powers. Part of the key principles of modern constitutionalism is the principle of constitutional supremacy, or the principle of supremacy of the constitution, which dictates the constitutional rules and principles that are binding on all branches and levels of government, and have precedence over any other rules that are made by the government. Any law that is inconsistent with the Constitution, either on procedural or substantive ground, will automatically have no force of law. And this is well affirmed in terms of Section 2 Constitution, which is often referred to as the supremacy of the Constitution clause, which provides that this Constitution is the supreme law of the Republic. Law or conduct inconsistent with it is invalid, and the obligations imposed by it must be fulfilled. Given the supremacy of the Constitution, some might wonder how to view the Constitution through the lens of decolonization and Africanization. It all lies in the transformative nature of the Constitution itself. The South African Constitution is transformative in nature. Its constitutional democracy seeks to transform our legal system and society at large. Its fundamental values of human dignity, the achievement of equality, and the advancement of human rights and freedoms introduce a new ethos that should permeate the entire legal system and have the concrete practical, realistic transformation in the society at large. Thus, law graduates, upon completion of the their studies, more in particular in this regard, the LLB degree, they need to possess comprehensive and sound knowledge and understanding of the South African Constitution and its basic areas. In terms of critical thinking skills, the graduates, according to the Constitution, they need to recognize and reflect on the role and the place of law in the South African society and beyond. So UNISA has implemented a transformation charter that is based on 5 pillars and 8 dimensions. In response to this charter, curriculum transformation is high on the agenda. Curriculum transformation includes the following pillars at UNISA: student-centered scholarship, the pedagogical renewal of teaching and assessment practices, the scholarship of teaching and learning, and the infusing of African epistemologies and philosophies. The relevance of these to constitutional law cannot be underestimated. It is therefore appropriate to quote Frantz Fanon, who states that for colonialism's systemic negation of the other person and a furious determination to deny the other person all attributes of humanity, they dominated inevitably and constantly ask themselves, in reality, who am I? To decolonize, contends John Murungi, is to remove the harm that has been done by colonialism. No human being has been unaffected in the process of colonization, he continues, and hence we all must undergo the process of decolonization. As human beings, our human dignity is indivisible. No one can wholly make a case for one's well-being without making a case for the well-being of all other human beings. Murungi continues and argues that if colonization was objectionable because it dehumanized Africans, clearly Africans cannot pursue decolonization at the expense of the dignity of fellow Africans or at the dignity of any other people. Africans are not immunized from dehumanizing fellow Africans or other people. The dehumanized can become the dehumanizers. Post-colonial African provides ample evidence to demonstrate that this is indeed the case. Dehumanization is not an invention of the colonizers, it predates them and most likely is bound to happen in future. Now I look at the element of personal is political, decolonization of the law through the dynamic power of identity and culture. In 2010, the judiciary complained that law graduates are out of their depth and lack communication skills. In addition, the 2014 white paper on post-school education and training concedes that there is a widespread concern that learners emerging from basic education are insufficiently prepared for further study, inhibited through the veritable lack of adequate reading, writing, and comprehension skills. When students struggle to comprehend the study material, they consequently suffer feelings of inadequacy and deficiency. It is possible that colonization is the cause of the incomprehension of constitutional law because of the transplantation of judicial institutions from the developed world into developing states with no regard for the domestic circumstances. This is unsustainable and invariably results in a repeated cycle of violence, government collapsing, rights being altered, property being expropriated, new constitutions being written and policies altered overnight. The philosopher Paulo Frey wrote in 1975 that students must become active participants in creating and negotiating knowledge so as to prevent the situation where they simply adapt to the world of oppression by consuming information without thinking critically. Therefore, to achieve transformation, you, the student, need to actively participate in creating alternative and decolonized epistemologies or knowledge systems that will resonate with the inextricable link to your understanding of yourself, which is identity, and the society in which you operate in reference to the culture. Changing the way you think and the way you behave should result in a political shift taking place, which carries with it personal ownership of the process and the outcomes. Inevitably, the process and the outcomes will thus be more legitimate, just, and equitable, particularly since they affirm self worth and culture. The contribution of indigenous knowledge systems to theories of self-determination, education, and survival is crucial in eradicating the grip of colonialism. A general consensus about some of the crucial attributes of a complete law graduate encompass graduates who flourish in knowledge creation and original thinking as stimulated by the desire to be active contributors rather than being passive recipients of knowledge. From a student-centered perspective, this desire hinges on self-directed learning while addressing the invisibility of students' voice in the renewal of legal pedagogy, including constitutional law, which is taught in institutions of higher learning, in particular the schools or faculties of law that provides for legal education. Now I will deal with the meanings of decolonized and constitutionalized constitutional law. Decolonization and decoloniality means working towards a vision of human life that is not dependent upon or structured by the forced imposition of one ideal of society over those that differ, which is what coloniality does, and hence where decolonization of the mind should uh, take place in terms of epistemically ensuring that the ideas of the colonizer are uprooted fully so. According to Muchabi, the importance of legal ideas is that they falsely portray that the minds and the knowledge of Africans have nothing significant to offer to the International Fellowship of Scholars. And Muchabi further argues that the Western theories are used in Africa, that the Western theories that are used in Africa are inadequate in terms of using them to solve the local African problems. Decolonization, therefore, requires an outlook that is embodied in a set of perspectives, and the question of what decolonization does not only rely on a single or one-dimensional answer. One perspective is an inside-out vision from Africa into the world, founded on an African context with a prime focus on Africa, and in which the continent and the people are central. This is to situate Africans within its own original epistemologies and knowledge production, interpreting existing bodies of knowledge and providing cognitive justice through the few African philosophies or jurisprudence. All these must be done from a constitutional law standpoint, with the main intention or objective to ensure that constitutional law it becomes decolonized and Africanized. Scholars committed to substantive decolonization are bound to decolonize knowledge through the decoloniality of knowledge itself and through the true liberation of the academy. This becomes a realistic operational possibility through requiring considerable application. Muchabi again argues that this effort is vitally important given the deep alienation of South African university students who have faint voices in terms of the curriculum transformation of legal education. Decolonization transcends identity and liberation politics to require epistemic and academic change. Torres submits that what am I saying and what intellectuals are seeking to advance the discourse of decolonization makes it clear is that beyond the dialectics of identity and liberation, recognition and distribution, we have to add the imperative of epistemic decolonization and, in fact, of a consistent decolonization of the human reality. For that, one must build new concepts and being willing to revise critically all the received theories and ideas from colonial education. Torres further indicates that colonial education must represent a variety of phenomena, including the people, the lands, knowledge. It impedes access to the full range of knowledge, and it prevents the free inquiry and the search for the truth, and it destroys other knowledge inconsistent with the nature of colonialism. Guiding us is the National Development Plan that has been adopted, I think, around 2013 or 14, if I'm not mistaken. The National Development Plan is aimed at ensuring that the government of South Africa and the country as a whole is able to achieve certain developmental plans, which are really comprehensive across different sectors of society. The plan is aimed to be achieved by the year 2030. The NDP, which is an abbreviation of the National Development Plan, it emphasizes that South Africa's emerging identity, ethics, morality, indigenous systems, the struggle for liberation, the constitution, and the creation of non-racial society. Since South Africa has a homegrown constitution which contains elements of typically African concepts such as ubuntu, we should understand and interpret and develop the law with reference to indigenous values. For example, since ubuntu essentially means that everybody counts in society, ubuntu's relationship with the constitutional law principles of the rule of law and democracy is clear. With respect to the rule of law, two prominent Africanists, Mbembe and Ramose, they argue that Ubuntu is a process of community making that is premised on respecting the humanity of others and engaging in ethical interaction with others. Their view is thus that all of us must follow the rules all of the time to illustrate our respect and concern for each other's well-being. Once a pattern forms where certain people do not follow the rules, it will be absurd to expect ethical behavior from some but not others. On this thinking, anarchy could result if we do not act ethically. Similarly, in a democracy, everyone's opinion counts and must be counted. This is the epitome of multi-party democracy which South Africa has. Everyone's place in society and the right to be heard must be respected. Parliament is the representation of democracy in action because it is a direct consequence of elections that have been held, that the members of parliament are elected by us, the people, to represent our needs in that forum where the laws and important decisions governing our lives are made. Thus, Ubuntu is applicable to participation in the legislative process. As such, the people should be afforded an opportunity to provide their opinion on decisions that will affect them. What the case of Merafom Demarcation Forum and others versus the President of the Republic of South Africa and others as revealed to us in paragraphs 133 to 114 is that genuine public participation should occur. In the Merafong case, even though a consultative process have been followed whereby the community were allowed to air their views, the opinions of the community were bluntly disregarded. The majority of residents of Kutong opposed the constitutional amendment which will relocate Marafong municipality to the northwest province from Gauteng. Yet the legislature brought the law into force regardless of the dissatisfaction. As a direct result of the failure to give meaningful effect to public participation, the Kutong township of Merafong became ungovernable and resembled a war zone as residents refused to accept the decision to relocate the municipality. Therefore, the conclusion is that public participation is essential, but it must be a real public participation and not formalistic, thus giving the impression that it is taking place, whereas it is not in reality. At a minimum, we should have the legitimate expectation that Parliament will not act arbitrarily, but will instead embrace the views and opinions even of minority parties in Parliament and act strictly according to the Constitution. However, the evidence has revealed that Parliament lauded the public protesters' report securing comfort on the Nkandla matter in an attempt to absolve the president of any wrongdoing. It is thus unacceptable and intolerable for the minority parties in Parliament to be marginalized simply because there are fewer members of the minority in Parliament. Furthermore, in the context of scarce resources, as per Mokgoro's description of Ubuntu, corruption cannot be tolerated because it is those same resources which are required for society's development and survival. Ubuntu thus signifies the approach that everyone must act in solidarity towards a common objective. By inculcating a culture of thinking citizens who can function effectively, creatively, and ethically as part of a democratic society with an understanding of their society and be able to participate fully in its political, social, and cultural life, transformation will occur. Our approach is that we afford you optional opportunities for learning based on a well-constructed framework that helps to make complex information understandable, relevant, and personally important while maintaining truthness and accuracy about the topic. Now I will deal with the decolonization and Africanization of legal education. Mind you, almost in each and every school or faculty of law in South Africa, there is a module or a course or a subject of constitutional law. Currently, South Africa has 26 public universities, and 17 of these 26 universities have got law faculties or schools that provides legal education or offers the LLB degree. The starting point for the decolonization and Africanization of constitutional law must begin with the decolonization and Africanization of legal education itself. More profoundly, the stagnated transformation of higher education in general and legal education in particular has made it difficult to overhaul the knowledge systems in the legal discipline and at most South African universities, which remain rooted in colonial and Western worldviews and epistemological traditions. More so, in post-apartheid South Africa, legal education remains firmly in the grip of what Professor Mudiri stated, that it's a restricted jurisprudence, which entails having the majority of law courses that describe as the they only focus exclusively on law as an exercise in technical rule application, and they are structured around what the legal rules and principles currently are, in which cases they were decided or from which legislation or source of law they are derived, and what, if any, are exceptions that are applicable to them. In a constitutionally uh, mandated transformative concepts, the systemic approach to the decolonization and Africanization of legal education, it can be approached from various standpoints. Uh, the approach which myself I have adopted in an article that was published last year, what I did was to rely on the 4 drivers of curriculum transformation that were set out in a 2017 document that is entitled Re-Imaging Curriculum for a Just University in a Vibrant Democracy, a work stream on curriculum transformation at the University of Pretoria. So it's a curriculum transformation document that has been adopted at the University of Pretoria. So that document, it has got 4 drivers that it suggests or it shows that they could be useful in terms of transforming the education in or at the universities. In this context, the reference is with regards to legal education. So these 4 drivers are responsiveness to social context, epistemological diversity, renewal of pedagogy and classroom practices, and the last one is an institutional culture of openness and critical reflection. I will try to uh, briefly break down each and every of the 4 drivers. The driver that deals with responsiveness to social contracts, it envisages an increased and a broader participation together with the responsiveness to societal interests and needs that are regarded as essential features of a transformed system. Hence, under this driver, the transformed curriculum for legal education, um, which includes constitutional law, it must require the development of a compulsory foundational course for all first-year students in African history, thought and society, political economy, and human rights. And in addition, the social transformation, it needs to prioritize focusing on ways in which legal education can contribute to the development of society and the realization of dignified and sustainable life for all South Africans. More specifically, the empowerment of law students has to encourage their active participation in the transformation of legal education and constitutional law, which should transcend the academic discourse. It aims at ultimately reshaping the nature and the scope of the legal profession and society as a whole. So this driver of responsiveness to social context, it further envisions the thoughtful students who are part of a greater and diverse public. It foresees students who are able to contribute meaningfully to different communities and society. This can be drawn from critical thinking. Critical thinking, it entails, the ability of students to problematize the received wisdom within disciplines, to question old and new frameworks, to exercise perhaps the judgment and engage in present debate. In addition, their meaningful contribution must stem from the critical literacy, which involves the ability to independently read, analyze, reflect, evaluate, conceptualize, and synthesize arguments, approaches, and solutions. Then, with regards to the driver of epistemological diversity, it asserts that diversifying epistemology means bringing marginalized groups, experiences, knowledge, and worldviews emanating from Africa to the center of the curriculum. This involves challenging the hegemony of Western ideas and paradigms and for grounding local indigenous conceptions and narratives. Equally important, it states that honestly and critically reckoning with the histories of all disciplines and dominant traditions within disciplines in order to examine their underlying colonial biases and exclusionary cultural norms at the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and class, as well as the complicity of disciplinary knowledges within various forms of violence and oppressions over time. This involves, among others, the acknowledgement that even those few historically white universities that admitted a limited number of black students operated on the principle of racial segregation and that black people were mostly excluded from higher education. Most of them were encouraged to study in the Bantustan universities, which were universities that were meant for blacks, African blacks or black Africans, and there were other universities which were meant for the colored and Indian people. So the purpose of this was to perpetuate, the Bantu education at tertiary level. Then the third driver, it deals with renewal of pedagogy and classroom practices. The transformation of curriculum should involve the continuous rethinking and re-evaluation of the ways in which learning and teaching takes place. This includes responsiveness to and training in new pedagogical methodologies and approaches in legal education. It further entails pursuing inquiry-led learning and teaching. Rather than testing for memory, students must be encouraged to do more research and writing. Additionally, this driver seeks to address the invisibility of certain groups by critically interrogating the composition of students and staff, especially in disciplines that are historically dominated by one sex, gender, and race, and removing pedagogical and classroom hindrances in a way of inclusivity. From a human rights perspective, there is also a need to create a robust learning space that is affirming and sensitive to student diversity by actively including students across differences such as race, sex, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic class, or a disability. And the last driver is institutional culture of openness and critical reflection. Professor Shadrach Guto, he once wrote that every social institution, like every living organism, undergoes changes necessitated either by subjective self-will and the initiative or by objective circumstances and pressures lying outside of the social institution or living organism itself. The point is therefore not whether or not change is desirable. The driver for institutional culture of openness and critical reflection is states that transforming curriculum exhibits understanding that a hidden culture can be found in the spaces, the symbols, the narratives, and the embedded practices that constitute the university and the diversity or the lake thereof of the staff and student cohort. So the transformation requires exposing and resisting the subliminal uh, practices of the hidden curriculum that are part of South Africa's legacy of discrimination. Lastly, I will deal with constitutional literacy in Africa. Mind you, the need to decolonize and Africanize legal education from the current situation as we are now. It's a lecturer-student engagement where myself as a lecturer, I'm trying to impart to you why or provide to you the reasons as to why constitutional law needs to be decolonized and Africanized. The question again remains the fact that a law graduate, upon completion of the law degree, needs to also actively contribute towards constitutional democracy in the society. How will that student or that group of graduates also try to influence the society at large to ensure that the transformative context from the perspective of an decolonized and Africanized constitutional law is able to fully permeate the entire society at large to the extent that even those who do not have the legal expertise might be able to resonate well with the intended decolonization and Africanization of legal education. Yes, the truth, the knowledge of the Constitution is among one of the serious challenges affecting the project of deepening and sustaining constitutionalism in Africa today. Almost all the independent constitutions in Africa were in effect imposed by the departing colonial powers, sometimes with the complicity of the new leadership that had emerged. The consequences of these were serious. It led to, among other ills, the decades of corruption, incompetence, repressive, and autocratic governance. The global surge in democratic liberalization following the so-called third wave of democratization that swept through the continent from the 1990s has been marked by few writings and rewritings of post-colonial constitutions that actually attempt to entrench fundamental principles, institutions, and values of constitutionalism uh, from the standpoint of a decolonized and Africanized constitutional law. In all, but two constitutions, the Constitution of Botswana of 1966 and that of Mauritius of 1969, they've been adopted, and at least including that of South Africa, they try to ensure that the society at large becomes well informed of the basic uh, civic responsibilities that a citizen must know in order to ensure that the constitutional literacy it meets a certain threshold, the extent that perhaps during elections most people will participate in the democratic electoral processes. However, uh, you will realize that part of the post-colonial constitutional dispensation is that most constitutions do not provide for a clear-cut provision that requires the promotion of constitutional literacy. That itself, it also leads to uh, the uncritical application of the law to the extent that people they even fail to uh, view the constitution which they are applying from a decolonized and Africanized standpoint. Almost 3 decades after this new generation of made in Africa constitutions, several studies have tried to assess the extent to which they provide a solid foundation for the growth of a sustainable culture of constitutionalism, good governance, and the respect for the rule of law and democracy. One of the issues that has hardly attracted any scholar's attention is the extent to which ordinary Africans are today aware of the extensive rights and freedoms these constitutions are purported to have entrenched. Apart from the advantage that, unlike the case before the 1990s, Africans can now freely create a party or join one of their choice, as well as to vote or be voted for in elections. There are serious questions about how much else do they know about the content, the values, the principles, and the myriad of checks and balances provided for in these constitutions. What is the level of constitutional literacy? A constitution will certainly not serve any useful purpose if people who are supposedly brought to life own it and enjoy the protection of its provisions are ignorant of its content. Uh, Let me briefly highlight on the idea of constitutional literacy. I can see that I'm just left with some few minutes so that I could complete the lecture because as I've been informed by Professor Liston, the lecture is supposed to be for an hour. Perhaps for the remaining 30 minutes, we'll be dealing with the students' questions. So the idea of constitutional literacy seems simple to understand. However, just as the term literacy has proven to be more complex than is often assumed, the same is also true of the concept of constitutional literacy. Beyond the postmodernist theory of literacy, the concept of constitutional literacy may best be understood in the context of four discrete meanings usually given to the word literacy as it has evolved over time in different disciplines. The first looks at the literacy as an autonomous set of skills. This is perhaps the most common understanding of the concept and limit it to a set of tangible skills, particularly the cognitive skills of reading and writing looked at independently of the context in which this is acquired or the background of the person who acquires these. Oral skills on their own may not be sufficient but are taken into account when they enhance reading and writing competencies. However, the emphasis is on literal skills that enable easy access to knowledge and information. The second, understanding of literacy as applied practice and situated, is often also referred to as functional literacy. This focuses on the potential of literacy to help people move out of their particular disadvantaged circumstances into fuller economic, social, and political participation in society. The third, understanding, views literacy as an active and broad-based learning process rather than as a product of a more limited and focused education intervention. For example, Kizebo used this understanding in his work on the mobilization for an Africanized literacy that would directly respond to the pressing communication needs of the continent. This is a form of adult literacy with a focus on creating social awareness, which enable a better understanding of the world even to those with limited reading and writing abilities. The fourth, understanding of literacy, looks at it in terms of the various contexts that are produced and consumed by literate individuals. Uh, in a democracy, for citizens to be able to make informed decisions and choices about the people who will represent them and act on their behalf, they must be knowledgeable. They must be knowledgeable about the legal and constitutional framework that forms the basis for elections, and this can come only through literacy. Constitutional literacy is a 21st century imperative. In many respects, constitutional literacy often means a choice between constitutional arbitrary authority, empowerment, and marginalization, freedom, voice, and voicelessness. Constitutional literacy is one of the major threats to Africa's fledgling democracy because limited knowledge of the understanding of democratic processes has progressively facilitated the elite capture and the manipulation of electoral processes. And one cannot deny the truth that all these are some of the factoring consequences of an decolonized and an Africanized constitutional law. Seemingly or obviously, one could clearly perceive the importance of decolonizing and Africanizing constitutional law. However, one of the key foundations that will lead to a proper decolonization and Africanization of constitutional law, it includes promoting constitutional literacy. Obviously, it's undesirable that for law graduates or law students who have a limited constitutional literacy, at least as law students who are undergoing a teaching or learning that deals with constitutional law, you must ensure that your literacy level of constitutional law, it is at least fully equipped. At the end of the day, it is impossible for one to have a critical mindset on how to decolonize and Africanize constitutional law if one's ability of constitutional literacy is very shallow. I have come to the end of my lecture, and I think now I can hand over to Professor Livstone to facilitate the session of question and answers. Thank you, Prof, and thanks to all of you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mudau. I also need to thank Busi Siwe Nhlapo for recording the session. It seems to have been successful, so I'm delighted that there is a recording. And I do see a number of hands up. So let's see what the questions are, and then hopefully between myself and Mr. Mudau, we'll be able to respond appropriately. Now, I don't know whose hands were up first. Should I just go according to the list? I've got Kama Galeni. Are you ready to ask your question?
My hand is a historical hand. I'm sorry.
Okay. Karma, I'm not seeing. I think you've left. Peter McCassalis. Is there no question from you? Letuma Bosaletsi.
Good evening. Yes, yes. My question was actually my hand was up for a very long time because we wanted to follow the lecture as to where he was reading and all that. And since he didn't project, so we couldn't. It was hard for me, maybe I guess for some as well, to follow where he is in terms of the study material. So that was the challenge.
Yeah, Prof, can I respond to that?
Prof, can I respond to that?
Yes, please.
Oh yeah, I think it will be best that after each and every question, I will try to, or we may try to respond to students so that we wouldn't lose track to the full question. What I will do is to share the slide or the notes with the students after the lecture. Or I'll just try to properly arrange them in a good order, then I'll send them perhaps by Monday next week.
Yes, in fact, just to confirm, in the chat function, some of us were discussing it, and what Mr. Mudau had done is he had integrated 3 different discussions into one. So he had taken what is already contained in your study material, being tutorial letter 101, tutorial letter 102, especially that part titled "The Personal is Political," and then his article that he wrote, where I've put the little, it's very tiny, but it should still work, the link to the article that he wrote. So in fact, you already have access to all that material, but we will, Mr. Mudau is going to maybe redraft it in a more user-friendly manner that will integrate all the ideas into one.
Prof?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, you are right that my presentation was based on tutorial letter 101 and 102, including my journal article which was published last year. So the only part which is missing is the article which I have relied on in terms of obtaining information with regards to constitutional literacy. So I will also share it, meaning in totality, almost each and every element that I have touched on in the presentation, we already have the respective document. So I will just share the article on constitutional literacy. And yeah, I think that's what it is. Thank you.
Yes, and I must admit, I think that's one of the most important aspects of your lecture. So Siyanda Tiobile, are you here? Do you have a question? Vutimi? Yes, I can only see 3 hands. So please do interject if I can't see your name and your hand. Let us have a free discussion. So yes, don't know who that was. Was that Tabang? Anyone with a question? Shepherd, do you have a question?
Yes, good evening.
Good evening.
Yes, yeah, no, that was some interesting concepts that were given through there. My question is in the context of African nations. The whole idea of African nations is a foreign concept. Most of these are basically existing because they are, borders were drawn up and they now exist as imagined realities for some people. Now, a constitution is limited to the borders, perhaps not the principles, but the actual constitution itself is limited to the borders. And yet, if the very idea of the nation state as we know it today is an imagined reality that people actually have to buy into for it to actually exist, then how do you start decolonizing the document that relates to that nation state when the very system is based on is a foreign system? I don't know if I've made my question very clear, but yeah, that's the question.
That is a fantastic question, which I'm hoping Mr. Mudau is prepared to first offer an answer to.
Is that it is impossible for African nations to revert back to the pre-colonial era. So as much as all nations of the world have agreed to adopt the principle of possibilities, if I'm not wrong, which states that it is impossible or it is not desirable or it should not be effected that we should redraw the African countries' boundaries because this might coincide with tribal or ethnic groups and with the potential, to inflame wars. That's why during the adoption of the African Constitutive Act that provides the governing principles of the African Union, this principle of uti possidetis was also affirmed. So it is impossible for us to speak of a decolonized border in a manner that will also, fuel wars and tensions in Africa. So, as you say, this constitution perhaps might have been imposed or they are not working for African people. Again, I revert to the fact that now we live in an era of human rights. As long as these basic liberties, which are the basic entitlements which everyone has by virtue of being human, they are ingrained in the constitution. At the end of the day, each and every person will have the right to exercise their rights and freedoms. I understand that you could approach this issue from an anti-colonization standpoint with regards to the borders. However, we cannot revert back to the pre-colonial era. So to me, I think it's just a matter of ensuring that we still apply, the rule of law, the constitutional supremacy, as long as their applicability, at least, they're able to ensure that they promote constitutional literacy to the extent that individual citizens, they can be able to achieve or realize their own rights, political, civil, and socio-economic rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I can't resist adding a little bit to that discussion, because in fact, that is one of the points that we had tried to bring across in tutorial letter 101 and 102. And that is that even though we might have a constitution that resembles a Western constitution, the point of us having a constitutional court with such far-reaching powers is that it is the courts, and I'm saying courts generally, but I do want to focus on the constitutional court, that has the power to interpret the provisions in a way that is translatable to the African experience. And that's why in one of the PowerPoint slides I uploaded on my UNISA recently, I spent some time there discussing the role of Lekotlas, Indabas, Imbizo, the people coming together, making decisions on issues that affect them. And that's why Mr. Mudau had to refer then to the Merafong case, because clearly, if the people in Merafong did not want to be relocated, and they had told that those in power as much, and that despite their wishes, they were just disregarded, and the whole process of engaging them was a sham, that's anti-African. That is not how traditional African decision-making happened. And so my hope, at least, is that we will get to a point where our constitutions can be interpreted in a way that suits our needs. And controversial an issue as it is, the fact that we're having a discussion at present about amending Section 25 of the Constitution, that serves a legitimate purpose, because we cannot ignore the fact that our entire understanding of property law is based on the Dutch system, the Roman Dutch system, where ownership is an individualized concept, ownership of property. And that's anti-African. There was never such a thing as ownership of land. The land belonged to the community. So that's why this discussion is relevant, and it's going to be very interesting to see what the legislature comes out with. And remember from last week's discussion, our extended discussion on checks and balances and judicial review and the counter-majoritarian dilemma. It will be interesting to see what the Constitutional Court makes of that new law if people challenge it. So that's just what I want to say, is that this is why we teach you the study of law the way, especially in constitutional law. We want to make you able to think critically about everything that's happening around you and realize that there must be adherence to the rule of law by all of us, because, as Mr. Mudau said, if we don't, anarchy will prevail. And no one wants to live in a society where there's anarchy. We all want to live in a society where, and I have to use this expression because to me it is so compelling, where we get along and get ahead. Because if we all do work together towards a common objective, we will achieve those objectives. But there's far too much and I have to use the word factionalism, but we're all too separated. We aren't working cohesively. And what do we know about the African concept of ubuntu? Is that it means that the community is more important than an individual. In other words, we all need to work together. So I know I've repeated a lot of what Mr. Modau has already said, but I just want to say it's actually our roles to make sure that the constitutions we have in whichever African jurisdiction we may find ourselves does become an African constitution. Okay, so after that, who is next to speak? Peter McCasalis, your hand has been up, but I haven't heard you respond yet. So I still am not sure if you're actually with us or you can't unmute for some reason. So Vumile, Charlie, are you here?
Hello?
Please go
Hello?
ahead.
Yes, hi.
Please.
I was wondering if Mr. Modau can share his screen so that we can see where he's reading from.
Yeah. I mean, I'm speaking for him at the moment. I think he's.
Oh, I'm sorry, I cannot share. These are very